Okay, folks, so this is an audio recording of the Cuban Revolution, and I'm doing this one outside of large group due to the sprinkling of clips that made it difficult to transfer to YouTube. So make sure when you do get to a clip in here that you're watching it. The purpose of this presentation is to kind of blend for you the Cuban Revolution as an event, but also how the individual roles of Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and their vision for a new Cuba takes hold. So that's where we're going to be going with this. Just a quick recap, and a lot of this gets back to what we discussed in the Thursday lab, specifically on Fidel Castro. Castro attempted and failed a revolution in 1953 in Cuba and was arrested, sentenced to prison, but was released early. From prison in 1955, he goes to Mexico and organizes a group of revolutionaries that he then sets out with to invade Cuba in late 1956. And he's nearly defeated again. When he initially lands in Cuba in late 1956 to overthrow Batista's forces, he is forced to flee into the mountains, and there in the mountains he begins a longer-term guerrilla effort that ultimately succeeds. And that's really the topic of this next slide. Guerrilla warfare ultimately succeeds. That's the heart of the recipe of success for Castro's Cuban Revolution. Castro's rebels hide out in the Sierra Maestra mountains of Cuba, and they basically make Batista think that they're stronger than they are. They're really talented at bluffing their strengths, but one of their main factors in success is their ability to build relationships with the poor peasant farmers of Cuba over the course of 1956 to 1959, when the revolution ultimately succeeds. One of the things they'll famously do is they'll go out and steal livestock from rich Cuban farmers and give them to poor peasants. And over time, they gradually wear down Batista's forces. Batista is in the difficult position of having to put down an insurgency force within his own country, and all the while not having a lot of really deep public support. And Castro is able to wear down Batista's army and regime through the combination of things like sabotage and ambushing soldiers and doing what guerrilla warfare does so well, and that is convince the enemy that the insurgency is not going to wear down. Make sure you watch this clip and answer that question in your notes if you haven't already. I want to pay special attention to the partnership of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, because this partnership is what ultimately flourishes during and immediately after the Cuban Revolution succeeds. Castro initially brought Che on as a doctor in his revolution. That was the initial grounds for bringing Che along. But he quickly becomes a close lieutenant and almost a co-equal revolutionary with Castro. Che really flourishes under the stress of combat and fever-pitch nature of the revolution. He's very skilled at discipline, particularly amongst young and untested troops. He becomes skilled in military strategy and advises Castro on how to proceed on various military turning points. And ultimately, when the revolution does succeed in 1959, it's Che who gets a position as head of the Cuban Bank and takes a number of foreign missions at Castro's request to the Soviet Union and becomes a diplomat. So Che really flourishes in a number of diverse roles, and that really provides strength to Castro's revolution. Castro and Che ultimately are going to clash over foreign policy. We talked about this in the lab called The End of Che. Che is going to disagree with a lot of the Soviet Union's economic teachings and models, and he's going to have a role in bringing about the Cuban Missile Crisis, for which he and Castro are going to feel very dejected when it ends with the Russians removing missiles from Cuba. Ultimately, this causes Che to kind of leave any formal role in the Cuban government by late 1964, early 1965. Watch this clip, answer that question. Some initial policies and challenges that Castro and his revolutionaries face when they seize power in January 1959 in Cuba. Well, Castro sets about fulfilling one of his major promises, which is he was going to seize private property, particularly large plantations in excess of a certain amount, and break those large plantations and other businesses up for the benefit of the government, for the benefit of the state, and ultimately, as he would say, for the benefit of the ordinary Cuban citizen. So he breaks up large private farms, sugar plantations. They actually pass an agrarian law, which prohibits farms from being over a certain size, and any hectares or acres it is in addition to that size, that land will be parceled out to small peasant farmers. So to many Cuban people, Castro is making good on a promise. He also reduces rents for low-income Cubans, particularly Cubans living just on the edge of poverty. But this creates a number of economic problems. It creates a housing shortage and a living space shortage, and there's some real problems within the Cuban economy's ability to provide shelter for as many people as they have. Some problems that he runs into right out of the box in that 1959-1961 phase. Productivity falls. By 1963, the Cuban economy has cratered to lower outputs than it ever was under Batista. It suffers from what's called a brain drain, the fleeing of educated professional workers out of Cuba, going to places like the United States. You'll often see this in a socialist or communist revolution where people who are otherwise talented and can make money on their skills or intellect in a capitalist economy will often flee a nation that experiences a Marxist revolution. The U.S. makes life very difficult on Castro early on by refusing to buy Cuban sugar as a way of damaging the economy and hopefully convincing people to rise up against him. And they ultimately pass what is a series of what are known as embargoes, refusal to trade with Cuba. By 1960, there's a major one passed, and other variations are going to be continued in the years that follow. So a new Cuba. What does it look like? What does Castro's vision for a new Cuba ultimately entail? Well, land reform. That's a big part of it. He wants to give land to desperate Cuban small peasant farmers. This alienates a lot of U.S. investors and foreign investors who have, property in Cuba, businesses in Cuba. Big investments are made on behalf of Castro's government with the, pushing of people like Che Guevara in education, the young, healthcare. There's also major military spending. Cuba is going to build up a gigantic military by Latin American standards as a way of protecting the Castro regime and ensuring that the communist revolution holds and is not overrun by the United States or other outside powers. There are media restrictions put in place. Castro and Che are very reluctant to allow a free press, and they're going to place restrictions on journalists and, in many cases, see that contrary opinion does not rise up to rival them. And perhaps most importantly and most long-lastingly, Castro's regime increases its ties to the Soviet Union. There are all sorts of technological and economic relationships that are built partially to help Cuba cope and survive when the U.S. Places its embargo. So in a lot of ways, the U.S. embargo and the U.S. Hostility drives Castro into the arms of the Soviet Union. Castro is also going to make a conscious effort at various parts in his career to spread communist revolutions around the world. He sees that as part of his duty, and he'll do that in places like Africa and elsewhere. This is the last video clip that I'd like you to watch and answer that question in your notes. And with that, thanks for watching.